December 15th, 1945. Camp Shanks, New York. In a converted gymnasium that now served as a temporary processing center for enemy detainees, the air hung thick with the smell of disinfectant, damp wool, and the peculiar odor of hundreds of unwashed bodies confined in close quarters. Through the frosted windows, the early winter darkness pressed against the glass like a physical presence, and inside, beneath harsh electric lights that cast everything in shades of yellow and shadow, nearly 300 former soldiers of the German armed forces sat on wooden benches arranged in precise rows, their grey uniforms replaced by plain work clothes bearing the letters PW stenciled across the back, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of men who had believed one thing about the world and discovered they were catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these men knew as they sat in that converted gymnasium on American soil, breathing the strange air of a country they had been taught to consider decadent and weak, was that within the hour, a single performance would shatter every assumption they had carried across the Atlantic, revealing a depth of culture and humanity in a place where their former leaders had taught them to expect only barbarism and cultural poverty. The man who would deliver this revelation stood barely 5 feet 8 inches tall, wore the uniform of a United States Army private first class with the single chevron denoting his modest rank, and possessed a gift that would prove more powerful than any weapon, more devastating than any artillery barrage, in exposing the lies they had been taught to believe as fundamental truth. The gymnasium itself told a story of rapid wartime conversion. Built in the 1920s as part of an ambitious expansion of Camp Shanks, it had served for 2 decades as a space for physical training, basketball games, and social gatherings. The wooden floor still bore the faded paint markings of a basketball court, though now it was covered in places by temporary platforms and the accumulated scuff marks of thousands of military boots. High windows lined the upper walls, their glass thick with condensation from the contrast between the cold December air outside and the body heat of hundreds of men within. The ceiling soared 30 feet overhead, supported by exposed wooden beams that gave the space a barn-like quality, intimate despite its size. Against the far wall, partially obscured by stacked folding chairs and wooden crates filled with surplus supplies, stood an upright piano. The instrument was a Baldwin, manufactured in Cincinnati sometime in the early 1900s, its dark mahogany case dulled by decades of neglect and the particular abuse that comes from institutional ownership. Several of the white keys were chipped, showing the yellow ivory beneath. The black keys bore the accumulation of countless fingerprints, creating patterns like geological strata. The brass pedals had oxidized to a dull green, and the music stand was missing one of its supporting brackets, causing it to tilt slightly to the left. Yet despite this neglect, despite the visible wounds of time and indifference, the piano remained fundamentally sound, its strings still capable of producing the sounds that had been designed into it by craftsmen who understood that music was too important to build poorly. Private James Reese had been cleaning the recreation hall when he first noticed the old upright piano pushed against the far wall, half hidden behind stacked chairs and boxes of supplies. The instrument looked as though it had been forgotten, abandoned to the indifference that institutions show toward things they consider non-essential. James had been at Camp Shanks for 3 weeks, assigned to the duty detail that maintained the facilities where enemy detainees awaited repatriation processing. It was not the assignment he had hoped for when he enlisted in the spring of 1943, but then very little about his service had matched his expectations, and he had learned to accept disappointment as the constant companion of a black man in military service. He was 24 years old, though the weight of his experiences had added years to his face that did not show in his official record. Born and raised in Philadelphia, in a narrow row house on Fitzwater Street, in the section of the city where black families clustered together for mutual support and protection, James had grown up in a world sharply divided by race. His father, Samuel Reese, worked as a porter at 30th Street Station, carrying luggage for white travelers and accepting tips with a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. His mother, Ruth, took in laundry, her hands permanently reddened and cracked from the harsh soaps and constant immersion in hot water. They had 3 children, and James was the middle child, caught between an older sister who had married young to escape poverty, and a younger brother who had joined the Merchant Marine and disappeared somewhere in the Pacific Theater. The Reese family lived in 4 rooms, heated by a coal stove, that never quite managed to warm the bedrooms where the children slept under piles of worn quilts. James shared a narrow bed with his younger brother until he was 16, their bodies generating just enough warmth to make winter nights bearable. The bathroom was in the hall, shared with 2 other families, and there was always a line in the morning, always the smell of other people's cooking seeping through thin walls, always the sound of arguments and crying babies, and the occasional burst of laughter that made the hardship temporarily bearable. But despite the poverty, despite the constant struggle, the Reese household had something precious, a commitment to beauty. Ruth Reese sang spirituals while she worked, her voice rich and true, filling their small rooms with melodies that had sustained her people through centuries of oppression. Samuel played harmonica, self-taught, and on summer evenings he would sit on their front stoop and fill the street with blues that made neighbors stop and listen. Music was not a luxury in the Reese household, it was sustenance as necessary as bread. James discovered his gift at age 9 when his mother took him to church, and he found himself transfixed by the pianist who accompanied the choir. The woman's name was Sister Margaret, and she played an old upright that was even more battered than the one now standing in this military gymnasium. But under Sister Margaret's hands, that broken-down piano produced sounds that seemed to James like a direct communication from heaven. He watched her fingers move across the keys, creating harmonies and rhythms that made the entire congregation sway and shout. After the service, he approached her with the boldness that only children possess and asked if she would teach him. Sister Margaret looked at this skinny boy with his 2 large ears and second-hand clothes and saw something that made her smile. She said, "You got the hands for it, child. Long fingers. Good span. But do you got the patience? Piano is not something you learn quick. It takes years, takes dedication, takes practice until your fingers bleed, and then you practice some more." James told her he would do whatever it took. Sister Margaret agreed to teach him, charging nothing because she understood that the Reese family had nothing to spare. For 2 years, James went to church every Tuesday and Thursday evening, sitting at that battered upright while Sister Margaret taught him the basics of technique and music theory. She was a demanding teacher, rapping his knuckles with a wooden ruler when his hand position was sloppy, making him repeat difficult passages dozens of times until they were perfect. But she was also generous with praise when he earned it, and she recognized early on that James had more than just adequate talent. He had the capacity for greatness if he could find the right training and opportunities. When James was 11, Sister Margaret told his parents that the boy needed formal instruction beyond what she could provide. She recommended the Settlement Music School on Queen Street, one of the few institutions in Philadelphia that would accept black students. The tuition was modest by the standards of most music schools, but for the Reese family even modest was nearly impossible. Samuel and Ruth held a conference in their tiny kitchen, speaking in low voices, while their children pretended to sleep in the next room. They discussed the sacrifice required, the extra shifts Samuel would have to take, the additional laundry Ruth would need to accept. But they had heard their son play, had seen the light in his eyes when he sat at a piano, and they made the decision that parents throughout history have made. They would sacrifice so their child could have a chance at something better. The Settlement Music School occupied a converted townhouse in a neighborhood that was neither prosperous nor entirely destitute. It had been founded in 1898 by a group of civic-minded Philadelphians who believed that music education should be accessible to immigrants and the poor. By the time James enrolled in 1936, the school had a reputation for excellence and a policy of accepting students based on talent rather than race or economic status. It was not exactly integrated. The black students still faced subtle and sometimes not so subtle prejudice, but it was better than the alternative of no training at all. James's teacher at Settlement was a man named Mikhail Kozlov, a Russian émigré who had fled the revolution in 1917 and eventually made his way to Philadelphia. Kozlov was in his 60s when James became his student. a thin man with wild white hair and eyes that seemed to look through you into some dimension where only music existed. He had studied at the St. Petersburg Conservatory before the Revolution, had performed throughout Europe, and had lost everything except his knowledge and his passion when the old world collapsed. Kozlov recognized immediately that James possessed something rare. After the boy's audition, a nervous performance of a simple Bach prelude that nevertheless revealed innate musicality, Kozlov told him, "You have talent. Natural talent, the kind that cannot be taught. But talent alone is worthless. The world is full of talented people who never became anything because they lacked discipline. You will work harder than you have ever worked at anything. You will practice 4 hours every day, no exceptions. You will learn theory, history, composition. You will study the masters until you can hear their voices in your sleep. Are you prepared to do this?" James, barely 11 years old, looked at this intense old man and said simply, "Yes, sir." And so began 5 years of the most rigorous musical education that James could have imagined. He attended regular school during the day, but every afternoon he went to the settlement music school and practiced for 4 hours, sometimes longer. His fingers became calloused, then bled, then calloused again. He learned scales in every key, arpeggios in every inversion, exercises by Czerny and Hannon that built technique through relentless repetition. He studied Bach's well-tempered clavier, Beethoven's sonatas, Chopin's preludes and nocturnes, Brahms's rhapsodies. He learned to sight-read, to transpose, to improvise. He studied music theory until he could analyze the harmonic structure of a piece just by listening to it. Kozlov was a demanding teacher, perhaps the most demanding teacher at the school. He accepted no excuses, tolerated no sloppiness, demanded perfection in every detail. If James played a passage with even slight rhythmic imprecision, Kozlov would stop him immediately and make him repeat it 20 times. If his phrasing was unclear, Kozlov would sing the passage, demonstrating exactly how it should sound, then make James replicate it exactly. If his hand position was compromised, Kozlov would place a coin on the back of his hand and make him play without dropping it. But Kozlov also taught James that music was more than technique. One day, when James was 14 and had just finished a technically perfect but emotionally lifeless performance of a Chopin nocturne, Kozlov sat silently for a long moment. Then he said, "James, do you know what the word nocturne means?" James replied, "It means night piece, sir." Kozlov nodded. He continued, "Yes, but not just any night. Chopin's nocturnes are about the special quality of night, when the world is quiet and you are alone with your thoughts. They are about longing, about memory, about the beautiful sadness of being human. When you play this music, you must understand what Chopin felt when he wrote it. You must bring your own experience of night, your own loneliness, your own longing." Then he paused and added, "You are a young black man in America. You know something about loneliness, about longing for a better world. Put that into the music. Make these notes mean something." That lesson transformed James's playing. He began to understand that technique was merely the tool, that the real art lay in communicating emotion, in making the listener feel something beyond admiration for digital dexterity. He learned to bring his own life experience to the music, to let his understanding of injustice and hope and resilience inform his interpretation of pieces written by European composers who had never experienced what he experienced, but who had known their own forms of suffering and joy. By the time James was 16, he was one of the most accomplished young pianists in Philadelphia. He performed in student recitals, where his playing stood out for its combination of technical mastery and emotional depth. Kozlov began to talk about conservatory training, about the possibility of a concert career, but both teacher and student knew that such dreams faced enormous obstacles. In 1938, there were no major concert halls that would feature a black classical pianist. There were no orchestras that would hire one. The classical music world was rigidly segregated, and talent alone could not break down those barriers. Still, James continued to study, to practice, to improve. He took a job at a metalworking factory to help support his family and to pay for his lessons. He worked 8-hour shifts operating a punch press, then went directly to the settlement music school to practice for 4 more hours. His hands became strange hybrid instruments, one part calloused from industrial labor, one part sensitized for musical expression. Sometimes his fingers bled from the combination of factory work and piano practice, and he would wrap them in bandages and continue playing. Because stopping was not an option, he allowed himself. When the conflict in Europe expanded in 1939, James paid attention with the intensity of someone who understood that global events would inevitably affect his own life. He read the newspaper accounts of battles and invasions, of the German armed forces sweeping across Europe with what seemed like unstoppable force. He listened to radio broadcasts describing the fall of France, the defense of Britain, the eventual entry of the United States into the conflict after the events at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. James registered for the draft in the autumn of 1942, shortly after his 21st birthday. He harbored hopes, perhaps naive ones, that his musical training might lead to service in one of the military bands. He knew that the military maintained numerous bands for ceremonial functions and morale purposes. He imagined himself performing for troops, bringing beauty and culture to men far from home, using his gifts in service of the national cause. Those hopes were quickly disappointed. When James reported for his physical examination and was asked about his skills and training, he mentioned his musical background. The white sergeant conducting the interview barely looked up from his paperwork. He said, "We got all the musicians we need, boy. What we need is strong backs for loading and unloading. You look strong enough, pass the physical, so you will be in a labor battalion." James tried to protest, tried to explain his level of training, his years of study with a renowned teacher. The sergeant cut him off. He said, "I told you what we need. You want to argue about it? Because I can mark you down as insubordinate right now, and that will follow you through your whole service." James swallowed his protest and accepted his assignment. He entered basic training at Fort Dix in New Jersey, where he learned to march in formation, to make a bed with hospital corners, to salute properly, and to suppress any objections to the casual racism that permeated every aspect of military life. The training was segregated, of course. Black recruits lived in separate barracks, used separate facilities, trained under mostly white officers who ranged from indifferent to actively hostile. After basic training, James spent 2 years at Fort Dix as part of a labor battalion that loaded and unloaded supply trucks. It was mind-numbing work, physically exhausting and intellectually stultifying. He spent 8 to 10 hours every day lifting crates, driving forklifts, organizing supplies in vast warehouses. His hands, which had been trained to move with the precision of a surgeon across piano keys, now handled rough wooden crates and splintering pallets. The calluses that had developed from both factory work and piano practice were joined by new ones, thicker and harder, the mark of pure manual labor. James looked for opportunities to play piano during his off-duty hours, but opportunities were scarce. The base chapel had an old upright, but it was reserved for the white chaplain's use, and black soldiers were not welcome to practice there. The enlisted club had a piano, but again it was in a white-only facility. There was a separate recreation hall for black soldiers, but it had no piano, no musical instruments of any kind, just a pool table with a torn felt surface and a radio that rarely worked properly. For 2 years, James did not touch a piano. He felt his technique deteriorating, his fingers losing their precision and independence. At night, lying in his bunk, he would practice fingering patterns on the blanket, running through scales and arpeggios in his mind, trying to maintain some connection to the music that had defined his identity. But mental practice was a poor substitute for the real thing, and he felt himself drifting away from the person he had been, becoming just another anonymous laborer in an army that had no interest in his particular gifts. In the spring of 1945, James's unit was shipped to England as part of the vast logistical support operation that supplied the forces fighting on the continent. He crossed the Atlantic on a transport ship, crammed into the hold with hundreds of other men, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and vomit from those who could not tolerate the rough seas. The crossing took 2 weeks, and James spent most of it reading a battered paperback novel he had found in the ship's tiny library, and trying not to think about how far he had fallen from the dreams he had harbored as a teenager studying at the settlement music school. England was grey and cold and still bearing the visible scars of years of conflict, James's unit was stationed at a supply depot outside Southampton, where they unloaded cargo ships arriving from America and loaded trucks heading to the continent. The work was identical to what he had been doing at Fort Dix, just in a different location with worse weather. He lived in a Quonset hut with 20 other men, slept on a narrow cot that never seemed quite level, and ate food that was adequate in calories, but lacking in anything resembling flavor or pleasure. Captain Robert Morrison first encountered Private Rees on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. Morrison was 36, a former attorney from Boston who had been assigned to oversee the detainee processing facility due to his fluency in the German language. He had spent 6 months in occupied territories following the cessation of hostilities in Europe, conducting interviews, processing paperwork, and managing the complex logistics of sorting through thousands of captured personnel. The work was tedious but necessary, and Morrison approached it with the same methodical precision he had once applied to corporate law. He had stepped into the recreation hall to inspect the preparations for that evening's orientation session when he heard it. A cascade of notes, bright and crystalline, spilling through the dusty air like water over stones. Morrison stopped mid-stride, his clipboard forgotten. Someone was playing Debussy, Clair de Lune, and playing it with a sensitivity and technical mastery that seemed utterly incongruous with the utilitarian surroundings. Morrison followed the sound to find a black soldier seated at the battered upright, his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly as his hands moved across the keys. The captain stood transfixed for nearly 5 minutes, listening as the piece unfolded with perfect phrasing and delicate dynamic control. When the final notes faded, Morrison found himself applauding before he could think better of it. James startled, spinning on the bench to find an officer watching him. He immediately stood at attention, his heart hammering with the old familiar fear. In his experience, attention from white officers rarely led anywhere good. Morrison waved a hand dismissively. Then he said, "Where did you learn to play like that?" "Settlement Music School in Philadelphia, sir." "Before the war," James replied, keeping his eyes fixed on a point just past the captain's shoulder. Morrison stepped closer, examining the piano with new interest. Then he said, "I heard you play in London once, with the army band at the enlisted club." The captain paused, his brow furrowed. "But you were not with any band, were you? How is that possible?" James felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He said quietly, "I tried to transfer, sir. They told me they did not need any more musicians. They needed laborers." The captain was silent for a long moment, and James braced himself for dismissal or worse. But when Morrison spoke again, his voice carried an edge of something that might have been anger, though not directed at the private. He said, "I have nearly 300 detainees arriving tomorrow for a 6-week processing cycle. Most of them have been told their entire lives that Americans, particularly black Americans, are culturally inferior, subhuman, in fact." The captain gestured toward the piano. Then he said, "I think it would be educational for them to hear what you can do with that instrument." James looked up sharply, meeting the officer's eyes for the first time. He said, "Sir, are you ordering me to perform for them?" Morrison shook his head. He replied, "I am asking you to consider it. No pressure, no order, but I think it might be worth doing." The captain paused, then added, "I think it might change some minds." That evening, James lay in his bunk in the segregated quarters and thought about the captain's words. He thought about the Settlement Music School, about old Mikhail Kozlov with his thick accent and gentle corrections. He thought about the years of practice, the calluses that never quite healed, the way music had been the one space in his life where excellence was measurable and undeniable. He thought about loading trucks while less skilled white soldiers played in bands. He thought about what his mother had told him before he left for basic training. That dignity was something no one could take from you, unless you surrendered it yourself. The next morning, James found Captain Morrison in his office and told him he would play for the detainees. The captain nodded, showing no surprise. He said, "There is an orientation assembly scheduled for tomorrow evening. I will have the piano tuned and moved to the stage. You can choose what you want to perform." The recreation hall could accommodate 500 people, though tomorrow's assembly would host only 324, the precise number of detainees currently in processing. They ranged in age from 19 to 53, drawn from a dozen different captured units. Some had been taken during the final collapse in April and May. Others had surrendered months earlier. They included infantry soldiers, tank crew members, artillery specialists, even a handful of Luftwaffe personnel whose aircraft had been grounded by fuel shortages long before the conflict's end. Among them was Friedrich Weber, 31 years old, a former teacher from Hamburg who had been conscripted in 1943. Weber had taught literature and music at a gymnasium before the regime closed his school and reassigned him to military service. He had spent 18 months on the Eastern Front, where he had seen things that haunted his dreams. He had been captured near the Elbe River in late April, and the month since had been a strange blur of displacement and uncertainty. Weber sat in the third row of benches as Captain Morrison took the stage to deliver the standard orientation briefing. The captain explained the processing procedures, the interview schedules, the labor assignments that would keep the detainees occupied during their stay. His German was flawless, his tone professional and impersonal. Weber listened with half his attention, his mind wandering to his wife and daughter back in Hamburg, wondering if they had survived the firebombing, whether he would ever see them again. Then Morrison said something that made Weber focus. The captain announced that after the briefing, there would be a brief musical performance. He said, "One of our soldiers will be playing the piano for you this evening. I encourage you to listen carefully. Some of you may find it educational." A murmur rippled through the assembled detainees. Musical performance seemed oddly civilized for a detention facility. Several men exchanged glances, uncertain what to make of this announcement. Morrison stepped back from the podium and James Reese walked onto the stage. The distance from the side door to the piano was perhaps 30 feet, but to James it felt like miles. He wore his standard duty uniform, perfectly pressed despite the limited facilities available to him. His brass buttons polished to a high shine, his posture erect despite his modest height. Every eye in the gymnasium followed him as he crossed to the piano, and he could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure against his skin. He had faced audiences before, of course, at the Settlement Music School. He had performed in recitals for parents and fellow students. But this was different. This was not an audience gathered to appreciate music. This was an audience of men who had been taught to despise him, who had been indoctrinated for years to believe that people who looked like him were inferior in every way that mattered. He was not here to entertain them. He was here to prove them wrong, to demonstrate through his playing that everything they had been taught was a lie. James reached the piano and took a moment to adjust the bench, finding the precise height and distance that would allow him to play with maximum comfort and control. The gymnasium had fallen absolutely silent. 324 men sat in perfect stillness, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen. He could feel their curiosity, their skepticism, their confusion about why they were being asked to watch a black soldier play piano. Some faces showed open hostility. Others showed merely blank indifference. A few, perhaps, showed something that might have been cautious interest. He settled his hands on the keys, feeling the familiar smoothness of ivory beneath his fingertips. The piano was reasonably well tuned, thanks to Captain Morrison's foresight in arranging for a technician to service it. James took a deep breath, centering himself the way Mikhail Kozlov had taught him years ago, blocking out everything except the music he was about to create. Then he began to play. The opening measures of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata flowed through the gymnasium like water finding its level. The famous arpeggiated triplets of the right hand, supported by the sustained bass notes of the left, created an atmosphere of profound stillness and introspection. James rendered each note with perfect clarity, his touch light but firm, his pedaling subtle and precise. The dynamics started quietly, pianissimo, drawing the listeners into the music rather than imposing it upon them. Friedrich Weber felt his breath catch in his throat within the first 8 measures. He knew this piece intimately, had taught it to dozens of students, had played it himself countless times. He knew exactly how difficult it was to play well, how easy it was to make it sound merely competent rather than genuinely moving. And this black American soldier was playing it beautifully, with a sensitivity and control that exceeded what most of Weber's European students had ever achieved. Weber's mind reeled with cognitive dissonance. Everything in his education, everything he had been taught about racial hierarchies and cultural achievement, insisted that what he was hearing was impossible. Black people were supposed to be primitive, incapable of appreciating or creating sophisticated art. That had been the foundation of the entire ideological structure he had lived under for 12 years. Yet here was undeniable evidence to the contrary, flowing from the fingers of a man his society had taught him to consider subhuman. Around Weber, other men were having similar experiences of profound disorientation. Klaus Zimmermann, the hardened infantry veteran who had fought through 4 years of combat on 2 fronts, sat with his mouth slightly open, his scarred hands gripping his knees, his entire body tense with the effort of processing what he was witnessing. Zimmermann had engaged in direct combat, had seen friends fall beside him, had endured horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had believed that his experience of suffering and violence had taught him everything important about the nature of reality, but he had never imagined sitting in an American detention facility and being moved to tears by a black soldier playing Beethoven. Heinrich Vogel, the artillery officer from Munich, felt his vision blurring as tears began to form. Vogel had played violin before being conscripted, had loved music with a depth and intensity that made its absence during military service one of his greatest losses. He had performed chamber music in his youth, had dreamed of becoming a professional musician before practical considerations and family pressure had led him toward a more conventional career. The conflict had taken even his amateur musicianship from him, and for 6 years he had lived without beauty, without art, without anything to nourish the part of his soul that needed more than food and shelter and survival. Now, listening to this Beethoven sonata performed with such artistry, Vogel felt something breaking open inside him. It was not just the music itself, though the music was magnificent. It was the context, the impossible contradiction between what he had been taught to believe and what his ears were telling him was true. This black soldier possessed cultural sophistication that rivaled or exceeded that of most of the white Europeans in this room. That simple fact, demonstrated through music rather than argued with words, was more revolutionary than any political speech, more transformative than any military defeat. James moved through the first movement with complete technical command, but more importantly, with complete emotional understanding. He shaped each phrase with careful attention to Beethoven's markings, observing the subtle dynamic changes, the ritardandos and accelerandos that gave the music its sense of narrative and emotional arc. When he reached the famous ascending chromatic passages that led to the first movement's conclusion, his fingers executed them with such fluidity that the difficult technique became invisible, leaving only the emotional impact of the musical line. The first movement concluded with the quiet return of the opening material, and James allowed the final chord to resonate through the gymnasium, holding the pedal just long enough for the sound to bloom fully before releasing it into silence. For a moment, the room held that silence, suspended in the space between movements. Then, without giving the audience time to applaud or react, James launched into the second movement. The allegretto is often called the forgotten movement of the Moonlight Sonata, overshadowed by the famous first movement and the dramatic finale. But it has its own character, a gentle, almost dance-like quality that provides emotional respite between the melancholy of the opening and the storm of the conclusion. James played it with grace and lightness, his touch delicate, his phrasing elegant. It was the musical equivalent of a brief smile between moments of deeper emotion, and it served as a perfect bridge. Then came the third movement, the perpetual motion finale. That is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. Constant 16th notes in the right hand, supported by octave patterns in the left, maintaining relentless forward momentum for more than 7 minutes. It requires extraordinary digital independence, stamina, and concentration. Amateur pianists who can manage the first movement reasonably well almost always stumble through the finale, unable to maintain clarity at tempo. James played it at full tempo, every note crisp and clear, every accent properly placed, every dynamic contrast observed. His hands moved with mechanical precision while somehow still conveying emotional intensity. The music built and built, accumulating energy, driving toward its explosive conclusion with the inevitability of a natural force. When he reached the final cascading arpeggios and the triumphant closing chords, he played them with controlled power, allowing the piano's full voice to resound through the gymnasium without ever crossing into harshness. The final chord rang out, and James lifted his hands from the keys. For a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, there was absolute silence in the gymnasium. Then the applause began. It started scattered, hesitant, as though the men were unsure whether they were permitted to applaud, but it grew quickly, swelling into a thunderous ovation that filled the entire space. Men who moments before had been sitting with crossed arms and skeptical expressions now rose to their feet, clapping with an intensity that bordered on desperation. But James was not finished. He had planned a 3-part program, and he intended to deliver all of it. As the applause died down, he shifted into Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, one of the most beautiful and emotionally direct pieces in the Romantic piano repertoire. This was the music that truly broke through. Where Beethoven had demonstrated technical mastery, Chopin revealed something deeper. Emotional sophistication, cultural refinement, an understanding of beauty that transcended race and nation. The Nocturne's long, singing melody line floated above its left-hand accompaniment, and James shaped each phrase with exquisite taste and sensitivity. Weber felt his eyes beginning to burn. He had not cried since the day he had been forced to watch a village burn on the Eastern Front, but now listening to this music played with such profound understanding, something inside him cracked. This was not supposed to be possible. Everything he had been taught, every assumption that had structured his worldview for more than a decade, was revealed as a lie by the evidence of his own ears. Around him, other men were having similar revelations. Heinrich Vogel, a 43-year-old artillery officer from Munich, sat with tears streaming down his face. He had played violin before the conflict, had loved music with a passion that military service had forced him to suppress. Now, hearing Chopin performed with such artistry by a man his education had taught him to despise, Vogel felt the full weight of his complicity in a monstrous system of lies. The Nocturne concluded, and James moved immediately into his final selection, a section of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. This was a calculated choice. James was no longer presenting European classical music, he was presenting American art, and specifically, art that had emerged from the black cultural tradition. The opening clarinet glissando was impossible to replicate on piano, but James captured the spirit of it in his introduction, then launched into the piano solo sections with rhythmic vitality and improvisational flair. This was music many of the detainees had never heard before. It was jazzy, syncopated, distinctly American, and it was brilliant. The harmonic sophistication, the melodic invention, the sheer exuberance of Gershwin's composition came alive under James's hands. He played with joy, with confidence, with the kind of artistic authority that could not be faked or taught. This was mastery, plain and simple. Friedrich Weber watched James's hands moving across the keys and felt his entire understanding of the world collapsing. Here was a black man, a private in the American army, demonstrating a level of cultural sophistication that exceeded that of most of the white European soldiers in this room. More than that, he was demonstrating it with grace, with dignity, with no apparent need to prove anything except the truth that his talent made self-evident. The performance lasted 27 minutes in total. When James played the final triumphant chords of the Gershwin and stood from the bench, the gymnasium exploded with applause. It was not polite, token applause. It was thunderous, sustained, shocked, and genuine. 324 men rose to their feet, clapping with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as though by applauding loudly enough, they could somehow make amends for years of believing terrible lies. James stood beside the piano, uncertain how to respond. He had not expected this. He had thought perhaps his playing would be met with grudging acknowledgement or hostile silence. He had not anticipated this wave of emotion, this visceral display of something that looked very much like remorse. Captain Morrison stepped back onto the stage and raised his hand for silence. When the applause finally died down, he spoke in German. He said, "Private Rees has been with the United States Army for 2 years and 3 months. He has loaded supplies dug fortifications, and performed countless hours of manual labor. He has done this while being denied the opportunity to serve in a musical capacity, despite his extraordinary talent. He has done this with discipline and dignity. The captain paused, letting his words settle. Then he said, "I wanted you to hear him play, so that you might reconsider some of the things you were taught to believe." The assembly was dismissed, but the men filed out slowly, many of them in a daze. Weber found himself walking beside Klaus Zimmermann, the infantry veteran. Neither man spoke for several minutes. Finally, Zimmermann said quietly, "They lied to us about everything." Weber nodded. He replied, "Everything." His voice was thick with unshed tears. Over the following days, the impact of that performance rippled through the camp. James found himself approached cautiously by detainees during his work shifts. Most could not speak English, but they would nod respectfully or sometimes attempt a few words of thanks. Friedrich Weber, who spoke decent English from his teaching days, sought James out during a meal service. Weber approached the serving line where James was ladling stew into bowls. He waited until there was a brief lull, then said in careful English, "Private Rees, may I speak with you for one moment?" James looked up, surprised. He replied, "I suppose so." Weber struggled to find the words. Finally, he said, "I was a teacher before the war. Music and literature. I thought I understood culture, art, beauty." Then he paused, his voice breaking slightly. He continued, "I have been taught many lies. What you did on that piano, it showed me the truth. I am grateful. And I am ashamed." James studied the older man's face, seeing genuine anguish there. He said quietly, "Music does not lie. That is one thing I learned from my teacher. The notes are honest even when people are not." Weber nodded, his eyes glistening. He said, "I have a daughter, 12 years old. If I survive to see her again, I will teach her what you taught me, that greatness has no color, that we were wrong about everything." James felt something loosen in his chest. He replied, "I hope you do see her again. I hope you get to teach her that." The weeks that followed brought more such encounters. Heinrich Vogel, the artillery officer who had cried during the performance, approached James with a request. Vogel had managed to acquire some sheet music through the camp's limited library, and he asked humbly if James might consider playing again, perhaps during the detainees' recreation time. James agreed, and soon his informal performances became a regular fixture of camp life. These sessions were different from the formal assembly. James would play for an hour in the evenings, choosing a mix of classical works and American jazz. The detainees would gather around the piano, listening intently, sometimes asking questions through interpreters. They wanted to know how he had learned, who had taught him, what the pieces meant. James found himself explaining musical theory, describing composers' lives, sharing his passion for the art form with men who were hungry for beauty after years of destruction. Captain Morrison observed these sessions with satisfaction. He spoke with James one evening after a particularly well-attended performance. The captain said, "You have done something remarkable here, Private. You have taught these men more about America in 3 weeks than 6 months of orientation lectures could have accomplished." James closed the piano lid carefully. He replied, "I have just played music, sir. That is all." Morrison shook his head. He said, "No, you have done much more than that. You have proven that excellence speaks for itself. You have demonstrated dignity in the face of prejudice." The captain paused, then added, "When I return to Boston, I intend to write letters about what I have witnessed here, about your treatment by the army, about the waste of keeping you in a labor detail when you should have been performing. It will not change the past, but perhaps it will matter for the future." James looked at the captain with surprise. He said, "Why would you do that, sir?" Morrison met his gaze steadily. He replied, "Because it is right, and because I have learned something too watching you with these men. I have learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hate is not force, but beauty. You wielded that weapon masterfully." The processing cycle at Camp Shanks lasted 6 weeks for each group of detainees. As Friedrich Weber's group prepared for repatriation, he sought out James one final time. It was a cold January morning, and the men were gathering for transport to the ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic. Weber found James sweeping the recreation hall. He approached and said, "Private Rees, I wanted to thank you once more before I leave." James stopped sweeping and leaned on the broom handle. He replied, "You have already thanked me, Mr. Weber, several times." Weber shook his head. He said, "Not enough. Never enough." Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, carefully folded piece of paper. He continued, "I wrote this last night. It is a letter to my daughter, telling her about what I witnessed here, about you, and the music and the lies I believed." He held out the paper. Weber said, "I would like you to have a copy if you will accept it, so you know that what you did here mattered, so you know it will be remembered." James took the letter, his throat tight. He said, "I will keep it. Thank you." Weber extended his hand, and James shook it. The German said quietly, "I hope your country comes to value you as it should. You have represented it with honor." Then he turned and walked toward the door where the other detainees were gathering. James watched him go, then carefully unfolded the letter. It was written in German, which James could not read, but at the bottom Weber had added a few lines in English, to Private James Rees, who showed me that beauty and greatness know no boundaries of race or nation. Thank you for saving a part of my soul. Captain Morrison arranged for a translator to render the full letter into English. In it, Weber described to his daughter the shock of hearing such sublime music from a source his education had taught him to dismiss. He wrote about the shame of recognizing how completely he had been deceived, and the hope he felt, knowing that talent and humanity could not be suppressed by ideology. He told his daughter that when he returned home, they would begin the difficult work of rebuilding a culture based on truth rather than lies, and that this Black American soldier's piano performance had shown him what such truth looked like. James kept the letter for the rest of his life. It became one of his most treasured possessions, along with the worn sheet music from his settlement music school days and a photograph of his teacher, Mikhail Kozlov. The formal end of hostilities in Europe had occurred in May of 1945, but the process of peace would take much longer. James served for another 14 months after his performance at Camp Shanks, finally receiving his discharge in March of 1947. He returned to Philadelphia with ribbons for his service, but no recognition of his musical contributions. The Army's official records listed him as having served in labor battalions exclusively. But something had changed in James during those weeks at Camp Shanks. He had discovered that music could be more than personal expression or entertainment. It could be a force for transformation, for truth-telling, for breaking down barriers that politics and violence could only reinforce. He returned to the settlement music school, not as a student but as a teacher, using the modest salary saved during his service to enroll in formal pedagogy training. Over the next 30 years, James Rees taught hundreds of students at the Settlement Music School and later at several other Philadelphia institutions that gradually opened their doors to black instructors. He became known as a demanding but compassionate teacher who could coax extraordinary performances from ordinary talent. He spoke rarely about his military service, but occasionally, when a student expressed doubt about their own potential, James would tell the story of a gymnasium full of men who had been taught that excellence was the province of some races but not others, and how music had proven that teaching to be a lie. Friedrich Weber did return to Hamburg, where he discovered that his wife had survived the destruction, but his daughter had been evacuated to the countryside and taken 3 months to locate. He resumed teaching in 1948, working in the rebuilding education system of occupied Germany. He kept his promise to his daughter, teaching her piano himself, and speaking often about the importance of questioning propaganda and recognizing common humanity. In 1953, Weber wrote a letter to the United States Army, care of Camp Shanks, attempting to locate Private James Rees. He wanted to tell the American pianist that his daughter was now studying music at the conservatory in Berlin, and that she played with passion and skill that honored the lesson her father had learned that evening in December of 1945. The letter was returned undeliverable. Camp Shanks had been decommissioned in 1946, and the Army had no forwarding information for a black labor battalion private, whose service had been considered unremarkable. The two men never communicated again, but their brief connection had profound ripples. Weber became a vocal advocate for democratic education and cultural exchange in post-war Germany, frequently citing his experience at the American detention facility as a transformative moment. His daughter Anna Weber Hoffmann became a concert pianist of considerable reputation in Europe, and in her program notes for a tour of the United States in 1967, she wrote about the story her father had told her of an American soldier whose playing had helped restore his faith in humanity. Captain Robert Morrison returned to his law practice in Boston, but he kept his promise to James. He wrote letters to military administrators, to politicians, to anyone who would listen, documenting the waste and injustice of the segregated military system. His letters rarely received responses, and when they did, the responses were dismissive. But Morrison persisted, and his detailed accounts became part of the historical record that later scholars would use to document the experiences of black service members during the conflict. The upright piano that James played at Camp Shanks was sold as surplus when the facility closed. It ended up in a church basement in nearby Nyack, where it served for another 20 years before finally being replaced. No one who played it in those subsequent decades knew that it had once been the instrument of a quiet revolution, a moment when beauty and truth had combined to shatter lies that seemed impregnable. James Reese passed away in 1979 at the age of 58, his heart weakened by decades of hard work and the toll of inadequate medical care in an era when racial segregation in healthcare was only slowly being dismantled. His funeral was attended by more than 200 people, most of them former students or colleagues from the Philadelphia music community. Several spoke about his dedication as a teacher, his gentleness as a mentor, his uncompromising standards, and his ability to inspire excellence in unlikely places. Among his possessions, his widow found the carefully preserved letter from Friedrich Weber, along with dozens of other letters from former students, thanking him for changing their lives. She donated them to the Settlement Music School's archive, where they remain today, testament to one man's quiet insistence that talent and humanity cannot be constrained by prejudice. The story of James Reese's performance at Camp Shanks was not widely known outside the immediate circle of those who witnessed it. It did not appear in official military histories. It was not covered by journalists or commemorated with plaques or monuments. It was simply one of thousands of small moments during and after the conflict when individuals, through courage or talent or simple human decency, pushed back against the darkness and created space for light. But for the 324 men who sat in that gymnasium in December of 1945, it was a moment that could not be forgotten. Years later, when scholars began conducting oral histories with former detainees, many of them mentioned the experience. They described the shock of hearing such sublime music from a source they had been taught to dismiss. They spoke about the cognitive dissonance of having their worldview challenged not by argument or force, but by beauty. They acknowledged with shame and gratitude that a black American soldier's piano performance had begun their education in truth. The conflict itself had destroyed cities, claimed tens of millions of lives, and reshaped the political order of the world. It had been waged with industrial might and technological innovation, with strategic operations and massive armor formations, with code breaking and atomic weapons. But in the end, some of its most significant transformations occurred not on battlefields, but in quiet moments of human connection. In a converted gymnasium in upstate New York, a young black man from Philadelphia sat down at a battered upright piano and, through the simple act of playing music with excellence and grace, demonstrated a truth more powerful than any propaganda: that greatness of spirit acknowledges no boundaries of race or nation, and that beauty, when rendered with mastery, speaks a language that cannot be corrupted by ideology. The notes James played that evening have long since faded into silence. The piano itself is gone, the gymnasium converted to other uses and eventually demolished. Most of the men who witnessed the performance have passed away, but the truth that James revealed through his music remains, recorded in letters and memories, archived in oral histories, passed down through generations of students who learned not just technique, but dignity, from a teacher who had demonstrated both under circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. In the decades that followed, as America slowly and painfully confronted its own legacy of racial injustice, stories like James Reese's performance at Camp Shanks began to emerge from the shadows of official history. They revealed what those who had always been paying attention already knew, that Black Americans had served their country not just with labor and sacrifice, but with extraordinary talent and grace, often in the face of systematic denial of their humanity. They had played music that moved enemies to tears while being denied opportunities to perform for their own countrymen. They had demonstrated excellence while being assigned to menial labor. They had represented American ideals of freedom and equality while being denied both. James Reese's story is one among millions, but it carries particular power because it demonstrates how art can achieve what force cannot. When he sat down at that piano in December of 1945, he did not give a speech about racial justice. He did not argue or explain or demand. He simply played music with such profound artistry that it became impossible for those listening to maintain the lies they had been taught. His hands on the piano keys spoke a truth more eloquent than any words, that talent, intelligence, sensitivity, and cultural sophistication are human qualities, not racial ones, and that systems which deny this truth are not just wrong, but absurd. The men who heard James play that evening returned to a Germany that was literally and figuratively in ruins. They faced the monumental task of rebuilding not just cities but souls, of reconstructing a culture that had been poisoned by 12 years of totalitarian ideology. Many failed at this task, retreating into denial or resentment. But some succeeded, and for those who did, the memory of a Black American soldier playing Beethoven and Chopin and Gershwin with transcendent skill remained a touchstone, a reminder that truth and beauty could survive even the most determined efforts to destroy them. This is the ultimate significance of what James Reese accomplished in that converted gymnasium. He did not end racism or transform military policy or change the political landscape. His performance was not strategically important. It did not affect the outcome of any battle or influence any treaty. But it changed minds, which in the long run is perhaps the most important transformation of all. It planted seeds of doubt in the certainty of prejudice. It demonstrated through irrefutable evidence that human excellence cannot be predicted or constrained by ideology. It proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hate is not matching force, but transcending it, rising above it through the sheer power of talent and dignity. The generation that fought through the years of conflict from 1939 to 1945 has largely passed from living memory now. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers those years firsthand. The stories will survive only in archives and books, in oral histories and academic studies, in the occasional documentary or memorial service. But some stories deserve to be remembered not just as historical curiosities, but as moral lessons, reminders of what humans are capable of, both in terms of evil and redemption. James Reese's performance at Camp Shanks is such a story. It reminds us that art matters, that beauty is not a luxury but a necessity, that excellence demands recognition regardless of its source. It reminds us that propaganda fails when confronted with truth, that ideology crumbles in the face of reality, that lies cannot ultimately withstand the evidence of direct experience. It reminds us that dignity is not something that can be granted or taken away by external authority, but something that resides within and manifests through action. Most of all, it reminds us that transformation can happen in unexpected moments, in unlikely places, through simple acts of human excellence. A young black soldier sits at a piano. 300 men who have been taught to hate and dismiss him listen as he plays music they thought belonged exclusively to their own culture. In 27 minutes, worldviews crack, assumptions crumble, truth emerges. No shots are fired, no speeches made, no policies changed. But minds open, hearts soften, and the possibility of a different future becomes suddenly visible. This is what art can do. This is what truth can accomplish. This is why James Reese's story, though small in the grand scheme of military history, remains profoundly important in the larger story of human progress. It demonstrates that the struggle for dignity and recognition is waged not just in courts and legislatures, but in concert halls and classrooms, in every space where excellence refuses to be diminished by prejudice, where talent insists on acknowledgement, where beauty demands to be heard. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, Please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.